Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 17 of Logicast, the AWS News podcast brought to you by Logicata. I'm Carl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined, as always, by my colleague, lead cloud engineer, John Goodall. How are you doing today, John?
Still recovering from last week, which is terrible. I've gotten old.
From last week's podcast or from the other activities of last week?
That sounds so wrong. From double summiting, that also sounds wrong.
Ooh.
That's just,
Have you been climbing mountains?
Ugh. Oh, it felt like it, the number of steps. Did we make that joke last year?
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. We do tend to recycle jokes occasionally on this podcast.
Frugality is a leadership principle.
Did you take a look at your step count just out of interest? Mine was not far off 14,000 for Partner Summit, and the same again for AWS Summit. So that's definitely well over average for a home worker.
I don't think I did as much walking as that on either day, because I mean you legged it from the Partner Summit to another event, so there's quite a lot of walking there. And then on Summit Day, I spent a good half of it stood in one room. I'm standing up though, but not walking, because supporting that serverless event, which was great, and I enjoyed it. It was brilliant fun, and lots of the same question, which is always the way. But I don't think I did as much walking as I did last year, due in part because there was 3,000 more people to weave around.
Maybe you could get one of those phone rockers that artificially inflates your step count.
What would be the point? I might get a mouse jiggler.
If you have Vitality Health Insurance, you get rewards for step counts. So not I don't have Vitality Health Insurance, by the way, and I'm not falsifying my step count. Just but yeah, unfortunately,
would you lie to that little dashant? Would you lie to the dashant?
I haven't seen the adverts. I don't watch TV. Anyway, unfortunately for the listeners, it's just John and I today. We did have a guest booked in, but unfortunately, circumstances conspired against us. So hopefully we'll have him back at some point in the future. But it is just John and I for this episode of Logicast. So we're not here to talk about faking your step count. Regular listeners to the podcast will know that once a week, I curate a list of AWS news, which I share via my weekly AWS News Roundup newsletter. John and I then pick a subset of the articles that we would like to discuss on the podcast. So we do, of course, have such a selection of articles. And the first one is more of a feature announcement, really, than an article. From the AWS website. And this one is entitled Amazon Inspector Agentless Vulnerability Assessments for Amazon EC2 are now generally available. So Inspector, of course, traditionally required the installation of an agent on your endpoints, and now it doesn't necessarily. But maybe we should start with some definitions, John, of what Inspector is and does and how it's changed with this latest feature.
Yeah, I'm going to have to, because you've basically just done the whole bit.
I can't have done the whole bit. We're only 3 minutes into the podcast.
That's the whole article. That's all of it. All right. So Amazon Inspector, one of the great AWS tools that doesn't have AWS in the name. Brilliant. What does it do? Primarily, it's looking for vulnerabilities in software that you have running on your instances. CVEs, critical vulnerability exploit, I think is what that stands for, is what it kind of reports against. And you get a CVE number and CVSS score and kind of how damaging and important this is. And you get a whole bunch of criteria out of the reports for, how difficult it is to perform the exploit. Is there a proof of concept? Is there proof of it working in the wild? When was the last time it was seen working in the wild? How easy is it to gain the level of access to do the exploit? Is it remote code or do you need access? So on and so on and so on. It's good. It's useful. It's not like a replacement for a SIEM solution, because it does kind of part of it. It doesn't do things like file scanning or anything like that. It's basically looking for CVEs, and it kind of tells you that, all my instances need patching. All these things are relevant. And then you need to sort of go on and fix them by doing either manual updates or patching through SSM, depending on what your kind of stack looks like. Great, cool. As Carl said, it traditionally relied on an agent. It doesn't use its own agent. It uses the SSM agent to kind of gain that level of access. And that's kind of fine, really. That's kind of fine, because on the majority of EC2s that you'll launch these days, since about 2016 or so. The agent's pre-installed. Yeah, it's on all of the Amazon basic machine images. It's on, Ubuntu and Amazon Linux and various versions of Windows and so on and so on and so on. It's not on everything, but on 90+%, I think the agent's kind of already there and installed. So that's kind of like, why have they done this? Well, okay, it's not always working because you do have to do some permission fudgery to get the instance being able to talk back to Systems Manager, because it's not Systems Manager calling the instance, calling the agent, it's the agent calling back to Systems Manager. So you do have to do some kind of fudgery. I want to say a different word there, but I'm going to keep it PC. You do have to do some fudging to get the instance to be able to talk back to Systems Manager. So you have to do instance profiles and stuff. And people forget, people don't want to do it. People don't want to kind of grant that level of additional access because, well, I don't use that. Why would I bother? Because you should be. Right, what does this change do? Well, what this change does is allows you to get some data out of Inspector without having the agent running. That's useful because that just sounds useful to me. I can't think of why that wouldn't be useful. Does it in a fairly cool way, because what it's doing is it's looking at, and I'm looking at the thing now, it's taking its own snapshots of EBS volumes and then it's running those up internally and scanning that, which is great. Brilliant. Anything that I can have that runs more scans for me without me having to do anything, more better. Like that a lot. But it's not this massive revolutionary change. It's not giving you any more information than if you'd set Inspector up and set SSM up properly to start with. It's just lowering the barrier to getting that data, which is good.
Yeah, I guess if you've got a large fleet of EC2s and not all of them had the agent installed by default, this is a way to get some data out without you having to go through the rather obtrusive process of installing the SSM agent on every machine.
Yeah. I mean, if you've been running in the cloud for a while, and I do mean like it's 2016 or so, or you've got potentially thousands of instances, then what is a reasonably minor process on a per instance basis could be really intrusive, could be really difficult and hard work. Because if you don't have this set up for your 1,000 instances, and you've got to do it on all of them, that's a complete pain. That's a lot of work. That's several weeks of engineering time, probably, to get that to work right. Especially if you've already got some of them with instance profiles that give them access to certain things. And it's a pain. So this is good. This is nice because it kind of skirts around that potential pain. But in the scenario where you're a legacy customer, you do have to go and turn it on. So you do have to enable hybrid mode, as it's called. If you are new to Inspector and you go and turn Inspector on, hybrid mode is now the default, as you'd expect it to be. But yeah, if you're an existing customer and you had it on some places and now you want to use hybrid mode, you have to go and tell it to use hybrid mode. So I have to go and do that for like 10 installs now.
And I like that you caveated your estimate there. Don't worry, we're not going to hold you to that estimate of several weeks of engineering time, probably. No one's going to try and pin you down on that one, John.
Spent too long in a sales adjacent role.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, we like this new feature. So on that note, let's move along to the next of this week's announcement, which is all about AWS CodeBuild and how it now supports managed GitHub Action runners. So this is absolutely not my area, so I'm not going to steal your thunder here, John. I'm going to hand straight over to you to explain why this is cool. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe you don't like it.
Dull. I mean, I like it, but it's a bit like, who cares? Really? Okay, let's do some definitions because GitHub Actions is kind of outside of the normal realm of pod and AWS. So, GitHub. Everyone knows what GitHub is, but for those that don't, because I don't know, maybe you live under a rock or don't work in software engineering, GitHub is a paid for and sometimes free service that stores your code using Git. GitHub was bought by Microsoft many years ago now, but it's, you can go on just github.com, you can start using it, spin it up. There's free accounts and paid for tiers for teams and all that kind of thing. They have a built-in CI and CD solution called GitHub Actions, and I'm old enough that I remember being very excited when that came out because I genuinely sat on a piece of work for 3 weeks because I wanted to do it in Actions rather than Jenkins, because Jenkins is awful and Actions looked really cool. So I genuinely sat on a piece of work for that. And if my ex-boss is listening, I'm not sorry, Marcus. I did tell you that I was doing this and meh. But yeah, that's GitHub, and that's Actions and kind of all the rest of it. Actions uses runners. It's not uncommon for build services that I know, yes, running. It's not uncommon for build services to use what they call runners. Sometimes they call them executors, which is a reasonable thing to call them, except if you're in the UK, and that's who looks after the will of a dead person. It's an executor. But I suppose it's
That's
an
probably why we
accurate
call them
term.
runners. Yeah.
Yeah, probably. It's an accurate term. It runs things, it executes things. So the central service, GitHub in this case, says, I have this process I need to run. And then a runner goes and does it. Cool. Out of the box with GitHub, you get access to their shared ones, but they live in GitHub. They don't live in your environment. And this is kind of where we've said CodeBuild and the Code Suite tools have kind of excelled before, in that if you needed to keep your entire world inside the AWS ecosystem and you didn't want things living outside of it or having to tunnel into it, then you needed the Code Suite, because that was kind of where that was better. But all the feature sets and things were better outside of the Code Suite. The Code Suite has a bit of an odd relationship with GitHub in general, though, because there are lots of other third-party Git solutions, some of which are arguably better than GitHub. I mean, I prefer GitLab personally, or I certainly did the last time I looked at the commercial version. Maybe it's changed. But there's others. There's Bitbucket by Atlassian, if you're stuck in their world. And there's a bunch of others as well. But GitHub is kind of got this, I don't know, first class preference from AWS. If you go into the console and things, you see, particularly if you're setting up, say, like a code pipeline, you see what's your source of this. You can either have code commit, GitHub, or a third party option. So it's like AWS has got some sort of relationship with GitHub. Maybe, I don't know, because it's got this kind of first tier service where the other things don't. And this is kind of more evidence of that. So all of the commercial offerings for Git solutions that have CI/CD, and the big ones being GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket, all of them have the option to run your own custom runners. And that's just a bit of software that you can run on almost any piece of kit. So that's a Linux server, that's a Windows server, that's your laptop if you really must. That's a Mac instance if you're having to do builds in Xcode, all those kinds of things. And now there's just a much easier way of having code build using, well, there is a way of using code build rather than an EC2 as a GitHub Actions runner. Okay, cool. I can see benefits of this. This is quite nice. If you're a GitHub Actions user and you build things in AWS, you now don't need to provision EC2s to put your runners on, which is nice. I think that's nice. Or you don't have to spin up an ECS cluster and use Fargate. So this is nice. This makes your life a little bit easier, and it integrates you a bit more tightly into the code suite of tools. So it's nice. I don't see this being groundbreaking and revolutionary. And realistically, the vast majority of use cases I've seen of people using things like GitHub Actions, they've connected into AWS using something like OIDC, so that Actions goes, I need access, it gets temporary access, and then it comes into the environment. And I don't see a problem with that. That's pretty secure. This just feels like a pandering to paranoid CISOs. And paranoid CISOs, being paranoid CISOs, are going to say, well, we don't use GitHub at all.
Well, I have to say, John, you did seem to warm to it after your lukewarm reception to my introduction of the article. So I think perhaps you talked yourself into it a little bit there. You got a little bit more enthusiastic towards the end.
There's minor benefits for it, but it all feels a bit... I can't... I tell you what it is. I can't twig the relationship between AWS and GitHub. And yes, GitHub is the primary service for hosted Git out there, much as I prefer GitLab and have historically preferred GitLab. So maybe it's as simple as that, but there seems to be something going on between AWS and GitHub, because GitHub gets this first tier service, where if you're using anything else that isn't GitHub or code commit, you're kind of not out in the cold, but you have to work a bit harder. So I can't twig that.
Well, if any listeners know the answer to that question, please email us, logicast@logicata.com, and we'd love to have you on to explain that to John.
On that note, knows. Johannes might know.
This is his world, so he may well do. He's a hero, so he gets to know things that other people don't. So he may. Let's get him on again. Johannes, come on again. Explain. On that note, let's move on to the third of this week's articles, which is from the AWS Storage blog. And this one is all about evaluating public and cross-account access at scale with IAM Access Analyzer for Amazon S3. So fair bit to unpack there. Certainly IAM Access Analyzer is something that we use with our customers, not necessarily specifically for S3, because that's not all it does. It does more than that. But walk us through this one, John.
This is a bit of an odd one. It's perfectly designed for this service, but as you read through the article, there's a bit of and I'm going to use a very British term here, jiggery pokery that you need, a bit of hackery to get it to kind of do this. Because what we use IAM Access Analyzer for is external access for, IAM, which is kind of what it's built for. So we set our zone of trust as the organization, and anyone that's coming and performing actions that lives outside of the organization, tell us about it, give us a report. And again, it hooks into things like guard duty, so you can see that these things are going on, and that's kind of our use case for this. Hooking it up this way for S3, and I must confess I didn't read this as deeply as I thought, because I thought I'd be able to throw this out to a guest, but we'll muddle through. Hooking this up this way, what you do is you set it up for a zone of trust for the current account. And that way, that kind of makes sense for this use case, because you want to enable, checking for cross-account access, and that might genuinely be between accounts in your organization that shouldn't have cross-account access, i.e. your dev and your production organizations, accounts within your organization. They shouldn't have any access between each other under normal circumstances. So that kind of makes sense. It would be nice, though, if it was a bit less kind of jiggery-pokery. But, you set it for the current account, and then you kind of set it up such that it sends the findings for access to the S3 buckets back through to another S3 bucket, and then you can kind of review it from there. And that's cool, and that's nice. We like that. It's just an automated way, really, of finding things like public buckets, which shouldn't be public. And generally speaking, your bucket shouldn't be public. Like, if you're not sure whether your bucket should be public or not, they shouldn't be. That's kind of the line, and you have to work quite hard now to make a bucket non-private in any form. So it's good to know, because you might have been working in the cloud since before those defaults, and you might not know. So that's good.
But quick question on that: do you think AWS has solved that problem by making it harder to create a public bucket? And the reason I'm asking that question is we regularly featured
the leaky
public
bucket
buckets, leaky buckets in our newsletter, and other newsletters have done the same. So almost every week you would have at least one, if not more, leaky S3 bucket that had exposed some sensitive data on the internet, and the press loved to write about it. I just haven't seen a lot of that recently. No. So have the press got bored, or have AWS fixed it, do you think?
The press will never get bored of things like leaky buckets, because it's too good a pun.
True. So that should indicate therefore that perhaps things are not as bad as they used to be.
I think it's improved. I don't think it's solved per se, because the defaults obviously only apply to net new since the changes, and these were a couple of years ago now, I think. But it's not as long as S3's been around. It was always work to make a bucket public. But basically what AWS did, for the listeners that missed when we spoke about them previously, is they threw up a couple of roadblocks that just made it a bit harder for you to do it. So there's now an account level setting where you sort of say no bucket is allowed to be public in this whole account, which is useful for things like dev environments and what have you, or places where you've got PII, where you say there is PII in this S3 bucket. Macy has told me about this PII in this bucket. It's intentional. No bucket in this account is allowed to be public for that very reason. Cool. And then there's a whole bunch of other kind of steps. So you have to turn that off at the account level, and then you have to turn that protection off at the bucket level. And then, depending on either your bucket policy or the canned ACL that you're using, you have to enable public for the objects, depending on your particular setting. So if you want objects to be public by default, which was absolutely a thing you could do by accident before, you now have to write a specific policy for that. So it's a long way improved from, say, 5 years ago. I don't think it's completely solved, but it's a long way improved.
Well, the press is an interesting barometer for this situation, so let's keep an eye on that, and hopefully we're not going to see too many more of those headlines.
Yes. Back on message.
So, on that note, let's skip along to our fourth article for this week, which is an article from the AWS Cloud Operations and Migrations blog about how to monitor AWS web application firewall logs centrally using Amazon managed Grafana. So, web application firewall logs, definitely part of your day job, Don. Don, that's my father's name. I don't know how he slipped into this conversation. He's never been a guest, so no, he would absolutely not know the answer to this question. What's a WAF? It's never been a part of Don's J. It's all gone. It's all gone. I'm sorry, listeners.
You know they say spoonerisms is a symptom of a stroke.
What are the other ones? Anyway,
dementia.
WAF logs are a part of John's day job. There we go. That's easy for me to say. That was all I was trying to say. So managed Grafana, not something we have spoken about it before, I think, but not something that we are using deeply yet to solve this particular issue. But having read the article, John, do you think it's going to change your day job?
No.
Is it something worth exploring? No.
Well, kind of. It's the timing is a bit odd, because if you scroll down, I mean, central viewing of your WAF logs through Grafana. Okay, fine. Central viewing of your WAF logs in general is really handy. It's really handy, because up until 3 months ago, I think, parsing WAF data in near real time, which is kind of what you need with a firewall. Like, you're under attack, I need to see about the data now. I don't need it in an hour's time. I can cope with a 5 to 10 minute delay. Cool, but I need it basically now. That was quite hard. That was a lot of work, and you needed solutions like this in place, where you could sort of have the data thrown through and look at it in a graphing tool. And Grafana is, one of the better graphing tools out there. Cool, brilliant. But then they came out with their own kind of updated default dashboard that shows you basically all of this, but it's on a per account basis. And I mean, with Network Firewall Manager you can enable through organizations, something like that. It does a similar sort of thing, as far as I understand, where you can centrally look at these sorts of things. So the timing on this for me is a bit suspect. And for a lot of kind of our customers, at least in the small and medium-sized business space, they've only got one production account where they're running. So do you really need to centralize all of your data? You kind of want to look at prod and dev separately from each other. For your oil and gas giants, for argument's sake, or for your Amazons of the world, yes, I can see that they'd have lots of different production accounts and lots of different workloads. And this would be potentially useful if you're seeing spillover from attacks, which, again, happens. But this feels like this blog was caught up in a publishing pipeline somewhere, and the announcement of, oh, we've done all of this for you, which is where I was going with this article, because my argument for these sorts of things is, this is brilliant, I like this, but why haven't they done it for us? It feels like that argument is moot because they've done it all for us, unless I'm missing a point somewhere. I don't know.
Maybe just a use case for Grafana, perhaps. The Grafana team trying to conjure up different ways to use that service.
I don't know. Maybe. I suppose the point with something like managed Grafana is, whilst this is what do they call it? This is prescriptive guidance, if you like. It's here's how you can do it, and they've done the CloudFormation stack for you, and they've done the big nice diagram using, I think, the correct service icons. You have to tell me. But correct, cool. Using the right service icons, and they've done kind of all the legwork, so you can just deploy this into your sort of central account. That's great, and we like this. Oh yeah, no, it is using Firewall Manager, so I was wrong about Firewall Manager. This is using Firewall Manager. Fine. And I like Grafana. I do. I generally like this, but it's okay. It's more extensible than the out of the box option, because the out of the box option on a per account basis is just, here's the data. Cool. But for 95% of use cases, that's what you want, right? I want, here's the data. Here's what you need to care about. Great. Love that. It's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of things like Datadog, because Datadog, being one of the more expensive tools you can use for monitoring stuff, is best in class because you install it to the account level, and maybe you put agents on servers if you have them, and that's it. You can do all your custom stuff if you want, but the out-of-the-box dashboards are grade A, class 1, spot on. They cover everything you need. So this is better if you've got lots of workloads and lots of different accounts that you need to care about, but that's a limited use case, I think, certainly within our kind of world. And it's more extensible. But again, 95% of use cases, I just want the data to be presented to me. Thanks.
Yeah, there was certainly no legacy service icons that were leaping off that architectural diagram offending me. However, the big grainy launch stack button did upset my sensibilities somewhat. I mean,
It's
it
an
works.
expanded JPEG,
Works
not a
fine,
vectored
but
image.
yeah, it's not quite the right resolution for that article or for my screen size. So
they're not using an SVG, are they?
No, but never mind. These are minor points. Doesn't really detract from the overall sentiments of the article. So on that note, let's move along to our final article for this week, which was a live updates from the summit, which of course has now happened, so they are no longer live, but they do serve as a useful record for some of the announcements which were made at the London AWS Summit last week, which, as we said at the top of the episode, John and I were both treading the boards there, 14,000 steps worth in my case. So we did try to watch the keynote, but unfortunately we didn't get to the keynote theatre soon enough. So we went to one of the other theatres that the event was being streamed to. But unfortunately, the event organisers did not sort out the Wi-Fi, so the streaming kept buffering. And if it wasn't for this article, I wouldn't have been able to tell you what happened in the keynote because I missed half of it due to the buffering.
Yeah, waiting for the YouTube stream to come out in about a month's time so we could actually watch the damn thing.
So we did see some of it, and of course, lots of AI, as one would expect. I don't know how many seconds it took for AI to be mentioned in the keynote.
30
but,
seconds or something. If
yeah.
there was an AI drinking game and a former guest, John Topper of Scale Factory, I think, whilst he was live tweeting this, did an AI drinking game, you'd be smashed. You'd be very, very drunk.
You'd want to play it with a very weak alcohol.
The problem is, if you did it with something like a beer, you'd be so bloated.
Yeah. Yes, you'd spend half the time in the toilet missing all the AI announcements. But anyway. But yeah, so we did hear a lot about Bedrock, as one would expect. AWS's mid-tier play in their 3-stack AI solution stack, for want of a better term. So it sits in the middle between infrastructure solutions and business applications. And
just have to tell the cat to not jump because she cut her head off in the boom arm.
Oh dear, yeah, we don't want to hear that. So yeah, lots about Bedrock, and the big announcement, of course, for London was that it's coming to London. Although that was one part of the stream that I did hear, and I was very confused about when it's coming to London because Tanuja Randri said that it will be coming in Q1 of H1.
Yeah, the first half of H1, which that might have been the buffering. She might have said the first half, comma H1. Don't know.
Okay. But I heard, first half of H1, which is Q1, which is gone, unless, of course, you're talking about the fiscal year, so we're in it.
Because Amazon's fiscal year is a bit shifted, isn't it? Yeah.
So very vague on when it's coming, but it is coming. So great news for anybody that wants to leverage the power of Amazon Bedrock to create generative AI-infused applications. But we'll have to continue to watch this space to know exactly when it's coming to London.
Because that was one of my big gripes last week, actually.
Yes.
I was big gripe about that because Bedrock is one of those. It's a weird service. It's got a very weird rollout pattern because it's come to Stockholm before London. Okay, wonderful. And then the models are not available consistently throughout the region. So the service is available in these regions. And then the first region, I think, that got Claude 3 Opus was Oregon, which is, again, odd. So even though Bedrock's coming to London, great, especially if you're stuck in financial services or somewhere that's got data residency requirements, which I've said this before, 5 years ago I thought was a nonsense, and now apparently the world cares. which I think is just a backward step. But there we go. You'll be able to use the service, great, but you might not be able to use all of the models. So we'll watch this space, I guess. We'll see what you get at launch.
Yep, and I'm sure we'll be covering that on a future episode when the announcement is made. So anything else tickle your fancy at the summit, John?
I mean, there was a few bits and pieces I tried to go and watch. I spent a good chunk of the day supporting a serverless security workshop, which I'm hoping to run at our user group, which was good. Enjoyed that. I had done the workshop 3 times previously, so I do know it quite well at this point because I've done it so many times. But that was good. Enjoyed that. Definitely enjoyed that. That was definitely worth doing rather than just swanning around in the UG lead shirt. I actually did some work for the shirt. Fine. Ran into more people than I thought I would that I knew, more than last year, which was interesting. And I did try to go to an EKS talk that Monzo were running, but I missed it because I was only 5 minutes, 10 minutes early and it was already full. You put Monzo's name on something and you fill a theatre, apparently.
I got quite excited about the possibilities with Amazon Q, actually, and hooking that into all of your various data repositories. I think it's got something like 40 native connectors now to hook into things like Microsoft 365 and Atlassian products and so on and so forth, just to be able to make natural language queries of all of your various data repositories. And we're a relatively small organization in the grand scheme of things, but we still have a number of data repositories, and often it is difficult to know exactly where to look for certain information. Yeah, I went to quite an interesting demo of Q being used within an organization and giving it access to all of your various data repositories and being able to use that to piece information together and gain insights out of those existing repositories. So yeah, quite interesting, and certainly one to watch from my perspective.
I mean, especially if you don't trust the Chat GPT, AI, whatever they're called, people with your data, and you've already got things in AWS or you're building a business off the back of AWS, there's kind of a bit more of an inherent trust relationship there, I think. So that's certainly a use case. And this is kind of the point that we've said with the Code Suite tools in the past. It's if you are in this ecosystem already, it's nice that there's other tools in this ecosystem that maybe not as good as all of the other tools out there, but they're kind of there. So you just sort of use them.
Absolutely. So on that note, we have reached the end of our time for this week's episode, Season 3, Episode 17 of Logicast. So thank you, John, for your insights as always. And well done for coping with our guest this week.
And the cat did jump on the desk. She's sat there now.
Well, I haven't heard any interference yet. So let's wrap up before that happens. So thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends. You can download Logicast from wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to see what we look like or the silly faces that we are pulling when we're talking to you, we are also available on YouTube.
Or
we'll be back next week.
My cat.
See your cat. Yes, it is real. He's not just a figment of his imagination. So check us out on YouTube if you'd like to see John's cat, Mouse. We'll be back next week with another episode of Logicast. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time.